thought they had forgotten me. 6 years. Long enough for someone to vanish from their own family's memory, if they ever truly remembered me in the first place. And yet, that morning, an ivory envelope sat neatly on the desk in my command office at the Okinawa base. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. Embossed gold lettering. Carefully printed full name. Colonel Emily Monroe. No one in my family had called me Emily since I put on the uniform. I picked it up, the thickness of the paper cold against my fingers. I knew exactly what was inside. A wedding invitation. Not a heartfelt message, not a handwritten note. Just one final line, colder than the rest. Behave. I sat still in the office as the sea wind rattled the window. The metal creaked softly. Like the whisper of memories I had tried to bury. But nothing could stop them from rising now, vivid as ever, like I was still standing at my father's funeral 6 years ago, when I wasn't allowed to sit in the front row, when my mother turned her face away like I was a stranger. I used to believe that time and dedication could heal anything, but now, what lay in that envelope felt like another knife, wrapped in silk. The bride was Lana, my younger sister, the same person who once told me during an argument, "You chose the military over family, so don't come back." And the groom was First Lieutenant Jacob Carter. I didn't need a reminder. That name was carved in my memory. He was the man I had risked my life for during an ambush in Kandahar 3 years ago. He had been unconscious, blood soaking one side of his chest, while I crawled through burning sand, rifle in hand, shoulder torn open by shrapnel. We made it out alive, but no one back home knew that. I never told anyone. And now, he was marrying the same sister who had cast me aside at our father's funeral. Someone once told me, family is the one thing you don't get to choose, but I know better. Sometimes family are the first to push you out the door without a word of explanation. My phone vibrated. A text from my aide. "Colonel Monroe, would you like me to book you a leave flight?" I looked at the envelope once more, set it down, and stepped out onto the balcony. From where I stood, I could see the new recruits training under the harsh sunlight. Sweat soaked through their shirts, but their eyes were sharp, full of purpose. Watching them, I remembered my first post. When I was just a girl from Ohio who joined the army to escape a house where there was no room for me. I turned back inside, picked up my phone, and replied simply, "Book the flight to Denver. Keep it off the schedule." I wasn't going back for celebration, and certainly not for reconciliation. I was going back to prove that no matter how hard they tried to erase me from this family's story, I still existed. And this time, I wouldn't be silent. I booked a red-eye flight. No business class, no checked luggage, no one to see me off. Just one dress uniform, perfectly pressed, resting in a protective garment bag. The same uniform I wore to the funeral of the closest comrade I ever had, now ready for another kind of battlefield, my sister's wedding. I didn't notify base command, didn't leave a letter for anyone. I didn't leave like a soldier on leave. I left like a shadow returning to reclaim its form. The flight to Denver felt longer than I remembered. I sat quietly by the window. No reading light, no food. The city lights flickered below like sentences that had never been said out loud. I closed my eyes. Not to sleep, but to let my mind drift between two worlds, the one I had lived in, and the one I was about to walk back into. When I stepped off the plane, I realized I had prepared for everything, except the feeling of walking into a place that had once denied me. The next morning, I arrived at the hotel listed on the invitation. The front desk clerk didn't recognize me. My name wasn't on the VIP guest list. I gave a small, dry smile, pulled out my military ID, and said evenly, "Emily Monroe. I'm a guest. No need for a welcome party. Just tell me where I'm seated." The young man glanced at the card for a second, looked a bit puzzled, then nodded. Yes, Miss Monroe. Table 11, outer corner near the AV room." I nodded, said thank you, and said nothing more. But inside I understood. I wasn't invited to be seen. I was invited to be hidden. I entered the reception hall just before the prelude music began. A pastel seating chart stood at the entrance, names printed beside tiny floral motifs. I scanned the list. Uncle Gordon, Aunt Macy, old neighbors, Lana's college friends, and then I saw it. E. Monroe. No title, no note, shoved into the bottom corner, right next to a misprinted line. Overflow, backup table. I didn't laugh, didn't get angry, I just thought, this is exactly who they are. The ceremony took place in a fall garden, soft sunlight, leaves just beginning to change. I wore my uniform, not for attention, but to remind them, and myself, that I wasn't returning empty-handed. As I walked in, a few guests turned their heads. Some gave a polite nod, others whispered, but most avoided my gaze as if afraid something might shatter if they looked too long. I understood. In this place, my presence was a crack they didn't want to admit existed. I sat at my table. It was next to the tech station, dimly lit, with speaker static buzzing right by my ear. Next to me sat a retired doctor whose name I couldn't recall, and a young couple who looked at each other more than they spoke. No one asked where I came from. No one introduced me to anyone. I didn't need them to say it out loud. I had long learned the language of being ignored. The music started. Lana walked in, white gown pristine, lipstick red like expensive wine. She smiled as if stepping onto a stage, not into a wedding aisle. Every eye turned to her, except mine. When the groom appeared, I looked directly at him. Jacob hadn't changed much. Still neatly groomed, alert eyes, a polite smile. But he didn't look at me. He didn't dare. I had once risked my life to pull him out of sniper fire near the outskirts of Panjwai. I was wounded, still dragged him back behind the line, our blood mingled. But here, today, I was nothing more than a nameless shadow. As they exchanged rings, I quietly took a fellow soldier's badge from my breast pocket. On the back was engraved the date I saved the groom's life. I didn't pin it to my chest, I just held it tightly in my palm, like a silent reminder. The ceremony ended in applause. No one clapped for me. No one looked toward the overflow table. But I didn't need them. I had something more important. The truth. And I hadn't spoken it. Not yet. The reception took place in a lavish wedding hall in downtown Denver, with high ceilings, chandeliers glittering like crystal, and a jazz band playing melodies as smooth as aged wine. Outside stood an arch of intricately woven flowers. Inside were curated toasts and smiles dressed in pretense. I remained at table 11, right next to the service station. One leg of my chair was uneven, squeaking with every slight move. Sharp, bitter little sounds. No one noticed. Or rather, no one wanted to. The food was excellent, the wine top shelf. And everyone around me seemed to be performing in a well-rehearsed play. The dream wedding, the perfect bride, the ideal groom. And me? I was the ink blot on someone else's carefully painted portrait. When the speeches began, the spotlight dimmed, leaving one soft beam on stage. Lana, the bride, stepped forward, her dress hugging her like it had been tailored for no one else. Holding a mic, her voice dripped like honey chilled in ice. First of all, thank you all for joining us, and what a surprise to see even my sister here today. All eyes instantly turned to me. Lana turned too, smiling as if delivering lines on a talk show rather than her own wedding. My sister Emily, who's been all over the world, guarding doors for high-ranking officials. Quite the career, isn't it? Sort of like airport security, but with a fancier uniform. Scattered laughter followed. Some covered their mouths, others looked away, but most laughed, not because it was funny, but because it let them avoid taking a side. I didn't react, didn't blink. I just lifted my glass of water to my lips, holding back the chill running down my spine. Lana wasn't finished. But hey, at least she was on time. Mom's thrilled. After all, she's military. Punctuality is kind of a big deal, right, Emily? Then I heard my mother. Caroline! From the head table, her voice carrying perfectly, as if rehearsed. Even if she's the disgrace of this family, at least she knows how to show up on time. That's progress. This time, the laughter erupted louder. Someone clapped softly. I looked toward the main table. Caroline sat upright, champagne in hand, her eyes on me like I was a malfunction needing removal. I knew that feeling. It wasn't new. Only this time, I was ready. I stood up, not in a rush, not in anger, just a clear, deliberate motion. Like entering a room thick with danger. The room held its breath for a few short seconds, everyone waiting to see if I'd respond the way they expected. Lana raised her brows, still holding the mic. Oh, you want to say something? Careful, don't make things too tense. I walked toward the center of the hall, polished leather shoes tapping gently against the hardwood floor. No one stopped me. No one stood. But the whole room seemed to shrink inward, tight as a lid trying to seal off a guilt that hadn't yet taken shape. When I stood in front of Lana, she blinked. I didn't take the mic from her hand. I just looked her straight in the eye and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're right. I guard doors, but the kind that stands between the people you're partying with tonight and death." Not a single laugh broke out. I tilted my head, glancing around the room. Many of them, the designer-clad guests, Lana's old classmates, the neighbors from the suburbs, had heard my name before. Some had read about me in the military news section, but none dared speak up. I gave a soft smile. In this room, there's only one person who's ever sat between gunfire and blood to keep a teammate alive. He's here, wearing a suit, playing the groom. I glanced at Jacob. He didn't smile. Didn't move. His eyes seemed torn between gratitude and guilt. In the end, he looked directly at me and gave a small nod. A wordless acknowledgement. I turned away, not looking back at Lana, letting no one stop me. I returned to my seat. No one said anything. The entire hall sank into silence, the heaviest sound in a party dressed in pretense. That night, I didn't leave early. I stayed, not because I was welcome, but because they needed to know I would no longer stand on the sidelines. Just as I sat down, the mic slipped from Lana's hand and hit the table with a sharp clatter, slicing through the spreading silence. No one moved. No one laughed. No applause. The once glamorous banquet hall now felt like a sealed greenhouse, cold and airless. Then Jacob, the groom, set his wineglass down. Slowly. Deliberately. He stood, straightened his suit jacket, and stepped forward toward the center of the hall. Lana followed him with her eyes, her expression losing its polish, as if she could feel something slipping out of her control. She whispered, "Jacob." But Jacob didn't turn back. He walked until he stood before me. Without a word of warning, he snapped to attention. His shoulders squared like the day he was still a first lieutenant. Then, in front of hundreds of wedding guests, he raised his hand and delivered a regulation salute. Sharp, crisp, unwavering. "Colonel Emily Monroe," he said loudly, voice ringing clear and firm. "I'm sorry. And thank you for saving my life. Everyone, please know, this is my former commanding officer, the one who pulled me from the edge of death in Kandahar." 1 second. 2 seconds. The whole room held its breath. Then someone dropped a glass. The crash jolted everyone, snapping them out of their trance. Lana turned pale. She staggered as if the wedding dress had suddenly become too heavy. She reached for the nearest chair, her lips barely moving. What are you saying?" Jacob didn't look back. Not this time. A man rose from a table near the window. He wore a simple suit, but his bearing gave him away. Retired Brigadier General Howard Dennison, former training commander at West Point Military Academy. He didn't speak. He simply stood tall and saluted. Another salute came from across the room. A woman in a formal gown, short hair, strong build. I recognized her, Major Erin Blake, who once served with me in Syria. She never took her eyes off me as she returned the salute, precise and steady. 3. One by one, among guests I had assumed were only there out of family ties, people stood and began to salute. Formal, respectful, and real. The room was silent with reverence. It was no longer a noisy wedding party. It became a moment of recognition, not of a forgotten sister, but of a woman who had served, sacrificed, and never surrendered. My mother, Caroline, sat frozen at the head table. She looked around and saw everyone's eyes turn to me, with a level of respect she had never imagined her daughter could receive. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to choke in her throat. I remained still. I didn't return the salute. I didn't have to. My silence was enough of a statement. Lana collapsed into her chair as if her wedding dress had become chains. No one approached her, no one offered comfort. She was no longer the center of attention, no longer the leading lady of the story she had crafted. Jacob turned to look at me. No smile, no more apologies, just a small nod, one I knew was genuine. I turned and walked away from the center of the ballroom. Each step felt like a closing chapter. No one stopped me. No one dared. As I passed Caroline, she looked at me with a mix of confusion, hurt, and, for the first time, fear. Not because I had power, but because she no longer had the power to twist the truth. I paused, meeting her eyes. You once taught me silence is polite, but sometimes silence is cowardice. She didn't respond. I left that room. The room that once rejected me, but this time, I left behind something they couldn't forget. The truth. 2 a.m. My phone rang just as I was removing the insignia from my uniform. The number wasn't saved, but I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring to the 4th cycle before picking up. Not out of politeness, but to remind them I was no longer under their control. Emily, it's Mom. Caroline's voice was softer than usual, like she was speaking in a room full of people who were all listening in. We need to talk, urgently, about tonight. I didn't respond right away. I pulled an old t-shirt from my suitcase and slipped it on, stepping out onto the hotel balcony. Denver's air was cuttingly cold. I let the silence stretch between us. Finally, she continued, voice a little more rushed. The press is asking questions. Some guests posted footage of Jacob saluting you. It's spreading. They're saying you were shunned by the family, that the wedding turned into a military tribute. We can't let this spiral. I chuckled lightly, my tone dropping. We? Or you? Silence. I could hear someone breathing hard on the other end, probably Lana. And I knew what was coming next. Emily. Lana's voice chimed in. If you could issue a statement, something that clarifies everything, that you were properly invited, there was no conflict, just a misunderstanding. Mom and I will write it, you just need to read it over. I leaned against the railing, the cold seeping into my chest. You want me to speak, to erase the truth? No reply. I took a deep breath and spoke slowly. If you want to do damage control, start by putting out the fire Lana lit 3 years ago. Silence on the other end, I continued. I was under internal investigation without a clear cause. My file was frozen for 8 months. An anonymous letter was sent to command, accusing me of fabricating missions, falsifying reports, and receiving unearned medals. No sender's name, but the writing style was familiar. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an old, creased printout, the letter I had kept for 3 years. I even had a linguistic analysis report conducted by the Department of Defense. Every punctuation, repeated, phrase, even the word irregardless. A grammar mistake only Lana ever used. I went on, calm as if describing the weather. 95% probability the writing was yours, and from that moment I was removed from the promotion list. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was betrayal. Lana gasped. You think I did that? I don't think. I know. There was no argument, just a long, stretched silence. The kind of silence I had grown used to. But this time, I was the one holding the power to speak. Caroline finally whispered, quieter than I'd ever heard her. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Because you never wanted to hear it? Lana cut in. I always felt like I was in your shadow. You were the one Mom bragged about, the one Dad was proud of. I just wanted a little light for myself. You were too perfect, Emily. I didn't think that letter would carry so much weight. I squinted, watching the city lights blur beneath the night mist. You didn't think. That's the problem. No one said anything else, but I knew this call wasn't about remorse. It was about reputation. I ended the call with one sentence. I won't read any prepared statement, but if you need a formal testimony before the Armed Services Committee, I can send it. I hung up. The next evening, I got a message from Jacob. If you could meet, just a few minutes, in private. I agreed. We met at a small cafe in the historic district, where no one wore gowns, no one pretended to be perfect. Jacob wasn't in a suit, just a dark shirt and a face that looked more real than it did on his wedding day. I know about the letter, Emily, he said bluntly. No hard evidence, but I suspected early on. Then why go through with the wedding? Because I was tired of the battlefield. I thought choosing Lana meant choosing safety. She offered a predictable life. No pain, no chaos. But now I understand. Predictable doesn't mean peaceful. I stayed silent, he went on. After the ceremony, I realized what I respected most was your silence. Not because you were weak, but because you knew sometimes silence is the loudest voice in the room. I stood up. Good, then don't use my name to shield anyone anymore. I walked out of the cafe. The night sky was still, and for the first time, I didn't feel cold. I thought I would feel empty after that wedding, but I didn't. I felt clear, as if all these years I'd been living in a fog and had finally found the exit. 2 days after the reception, when the media began knocking with flashy headlines like "Groom salutes sister-in-law in shocking ceremony" and "Veteran disowned by family speaks out," I knew I had to do something. Not in retaliation, but to protect those who never got the chance to speak the way I had. On Tuesday morning, I stood behind a temporary podium in a small hall at the Denver Veterans Center. Behind me was the American flag, 2 black and white ribbons, and a freshly printed logo, Sentinel Project. It was a small crowd, about 40 people, but the cameras were all there. The media had sensed this wasn't just a family drama. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need one. I looked at the front row, at the weathered faces, the tired eyes. People like me. People who had worn the uniform, who had held their squads together in chaos, only to have their careers wrecked by a rumor or an anonymous accusation from someone who once called them family. I began. In my 17 years of service, I was never afraid of the battlefield. But there's a kind of wound that doesn't bleed, doesn't leave scars on the skin, just quietly tears you apart inside. And the scariest part? It usually comes from the people who once called us family. The room went still. When relatives misuse your privacy to tear you down, when a marriage turns into a trap that holds back your career, when siblings, parents, even children become sources of harm, but you're expected to endure in silence because they're your blood. I say, enough. I looked directly into the camera. Today I'm announcing the launch of the Sentinel Project, a support organization offering psychological care, legal aid, and emergency response for service members harmed by their personal networks. No one in uniform should lose their career because of a family member's selfishness. We'll provide attorneys, mental health professionals, and confidential intervention protocols starting from the first signs of trouble. The click of cameras echoed like quiet gunfire. I placed a hand over my chest. I nearly got removed from the promotion list because of an anonymous email written out of jealousy. I know what it feels like to be doubted by your own command, not because you failed your duty, but because of a stray comment from someone you once carried as a child. And I know many out there feel the same, forced to stay silent to protect the family image. No, we won't be silent anymore. A middle-aged man in a worn jacket stood up from the third row. His voice was raspy but clear. My daughter was suspended for reporting her ex-husband, also an officer in her unit. They said she was too sensitive. Thank you, Emily. You just gave her a voice. I nodded. No words were needed. The truest recognition often comes from the quietest places. The press came at me fast afterward. Are you accusing your family? Do you plan to sue? Is this about your sister? I answered simply. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just shining a light on a truth we've kept under the rug for too long. If that light makes someone uncomfortable, maybe they should take a hard look at themselves. A week later, the video of my speech went viral, not because it was a scandal, but because what I said struck a chord in people. The part that had once been betrayed by someone close. I received over 500 emails in just 3 days, one young woman wrote. I thought I was weak for not being able to handle my father's control. Now I know that wasn't weakness. That was survival. I printed that letter and pinned it to the wall of Sentinel's temporary office. It reminded me why I started. I was no longer part of the Monroe family, but now I had a community. Soldiers, survivors, and those who knew that loyalty does not mean staying silent in the face of injustice. 3 months after my Denver speech, I was invited to speak at the Pentagon. I stood at a mahogany podium, behind me the national seal and a perfectly folded American flag. That room held over 200 senior officers, policymakers, military lawyers, and Defense Department representatives, all listening to me, a woman once treated as a ghost by her own family. I opened with a blunt sentence. We have protocols for handling threats beyond our borders, but almost nothing to protect service members when the betrayal comes from a relative or a spouse. I introduced the Sentinel Protocol, a 3-layered protection system for service members harmed by personal betrayals: immediate legal aid, confidential internal file protection, and an appeal process independent of family interference. An older general stood up, skeptical. Colonel Monroe, is this an emotional proposal based on personal experience? I smiled, not bitterly, just enough. Sir, any policy not rooted in personal experience is just theory, meant to sit quietly on a desk. The room went silent, but this time it wasn't shock. It was understanding. At the end of my speech, I said, we can't prevent every betrayal, but we can stop letting it thrive in silence. 2 months later, I left the service. No big send-off, no retirement party. Just a pale afternoon light as I removed the insignia from my shoulders, folded my last uniform, and quietly closed the door to a room I had lived in for over 15 years. I flew to southern Italy, to a small cream-colored house tucked under the Amalfi Hills, purchased with bonuses saved from special assignments. No one knew I was there. No one needed to. In the mornings, I brewed Italian coffee and set a chair on the balcony to watch the sea. At noon, I painted postcards I never mailed. At night, I wrote in a journal, not to record events, but to release feelings I had never allowed myself to feel. I no longer wore a watch. I didn't check my inbox every hour. I didn't instinctively stand at the sound of a siren. I lived, quietly, but truthfully. One June morning, little Luca from the village brought me a basket of freshly baked bread and a rolled-up newspaper tied with twine. His brown eyes sparkled as he chirped. Signor, my mom says the Americans came looking for you yesterday. They left an invitation in the mailbox. I thanked him and opened the note. The logo was familiar. the National Ethics Committee, office in Washington, D.C. A formal invitation eloquently worded. They wanted me to return as the new chair of the committee, tasked with setting ethical standards for the next generation of military leaders. I read it once. Didn't react. I simply set the letter down beside my cooling espresso. That evening, I walked down to the sea, carrying that piece of paper, and dropped it into the old fire pit where I burned scraps beside the cliff's edge. Not because I rejected prestige, not because I was angry. I declined because I no longer needed their approval. I had gained something no title, medal, or chairmanship could ever buy: true freedom. Freedom from expectations, obligations, or the fear of disappointing others. In my journal that night, I wrote, I once stepped into the world to prove I was worthy. Now, I live simply to prove I am enough. I no longer need to win against anyone. As I closed the notebook, the sea breeze carried the scent of salt into my room. I threw open the door, letting it sweep away the last remnants of what still clung to me. I don't know who will tell this story when I'm gone. But if they do, I hope they don't call me a victim of a toxic family. Call me a survivor, and one who truly lived. Emily's story isn't just about surviving betrayal by her own family. It's a testament to the power of strength and self-respect. In a world where silence is often mistaken for peace, she chose to speak, not for revenge, but to protect others who'd been hurt like her. Through pain, she didn't seek validation from others but found her true self. The greatest lesson: true freedom doesn't come from someone else's forgiveness. It comes from forgiving and freeing yourself. What do you think about Emily's journey? Have you ever gone through something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt, real-life family stories to come.